Ozzy Lazuth, Sri Fields, Russell Hantz, Sierra Easton. The list goes on. These are people that played notable games, making them returnees in Survivor that are easy to understand. This video is not about them. Rather, we'll be looking at the top 5 people that, let's face it, we were shocked to see them return, either given their first appearance on the show, or they just didn't fit into the returnee theme. Bleeding into number 5 is Andy Meldrum, who is a perfect example of my latter point. I loved him during Champions vs Contenders 2, in spite of continuously messing up, and I've even gone on record to say he should have been an Australian Survivor All-Stars. And the Australian Survivor producers seem to have realised this as well, because they brought him back at the next opportunity they could for... Where's my notes? Oh god. Season 7 of the reboot took the blood versus water aspect and made it weird. Most of the contestants were new with their loved ones, but there were 3 exceptions. One couple was Mark and Sam, who have essentially the perfect story for a blood versus water season. Meeting when single on season 2, getting married, having a child, and returning 5 years later. Amazing! Then there's Sandra Diaz-Twine, the 2-time Survivor winner, 4-time returnee, with the debut of her daughter Nina. Incredible. And then there's Andy Meldrum, pre-juror, merge boot with his sister Kate. I think you can tell where I'm going with this. Because Andy was so incredibly out of place on the cast, he stuck out like a sore thumb, making him an easy first boot. Had there been other non-All-Star returnees with their loved ones like Ziggy, Matt and Janine, Andy would have been less questionable of a returnee, but through no fault of his own, considering the season he was placed on, I put him in 5th by technicality. Another questionable returnee by technicality, at 4 is Brandon Hantz. Now within a vacuum, Brandon makes sense as a favourite on the fans versus favourites cast. On South Pacific, he was one of the main characters who won challenges, had a season-long storyline of cleansing his bloodline, an iconic albeit silly mistake of giving Albert immunity, and, as ridiculous nowadays as it may seem, actually had winner equity. So that all sounds good, right? Well, let's look at the bigger picture. The reason Brandon shouldn't have returned for Caramoan was clear on the show. He was absolutely chaotic and got into arguments with pretty much everyone on his tribe, particularly Philip. After day 13's reward challenge, Brandon had another meltdown. He originally wanted to urinate on his tribe's rice, sabotaging them, supposedly like his uncle. I don't think Russell ever did that in his 3 seasons. Brandon instead did an awful deed by taking his tribe's rice and pouring it out, and then the beans. Then announced to his tribe they should vote him out. In fact, his tribe was so repulsed by his actions, they came into the following immunity challenge wanting to give up tribal immunity. It wasn't like they wanted to throw the challenge, they legitimately verbalized the fact they wanted to go to tribal council. In an article with EW in regards to the psych test, he passed, claims Jeff. Now, I don't want to call out production, but it's a bit concerning Brandon could pass these psych tests, as well as the fact, 4 seasons later, they casted a man that now drinks his own piss. A lot of pee in this video, huh? Nonetheless, Brandon begins another tantrum, causing Jeff to take the wheel and Brandon's shoulders, pulling him away from his tribe and comforting him as, in an extremely informal tribal council, Brandon was voted out. Now, because of his actions, Brandon could have easily been higher, and I could easily understand people putting him as number 1 on their list, but he had at least a solid first season, keeping his head above water. Yellow water. On the topic of yellow, in number 3 we have the shining stars of Australian Survivor All-Stars. Now this season has quite a controversial cast, with a quarter of the cast being pre-merge boots. And on the topic of controversy and being a pre-merge boot, at number 3 I have Zach. Now, Zach, like most of the pre-merge boots, did greatly increase their placement on this season, and his returning game was actually decent. Nothing offensive, he just kind of played by the numbers in a second-in-command-esque way. But in his original game, Survivor Champions vs Contenders, he has the personality of an over-the-top bully in a high school movie. Nothing quite says all-star material like saying your female competitors could only beat you in a dishwashing competition. Zach was a massive jerk that annoyed his own tribe, as well as the opposing tribe, with unnecessary trash talk and muscle flexing. I think it speaks volumes. In spite of him being one of the strongest members of his tribe, he was a pre-swap boot. In fact, during an All-Stars reward where magazines were available, everyone had their personas or badass moments displayed, whereas Zach had him being sexist. That is not a good defining storyline to bring into an All-Star season of all things. This did somewhat spill into All-Stars with relation to Jackie, where he shouted at her during a pre-merge challenge and claimed he could go on forever in an endurance challenge he eventually loses to her in. That being said, and what I referred to earlier, he redeemed himself in All-Stars by being far more pleasant and greatly improving his placement. So while the story has a happy ending with everything taken into consideration, when you think of All-Star, Season 3 Zach is pretty low on that spectrum, landing him here at number 3. Now at number 2 we have Francesca Hogi. Francesca was obviously going to appear on this list. Let's be real. In Redemption Island, Francesca tried to revolt against Boston Rob, failed, ended up on Redemption Island, and lost the first duel. The end. And all in all, she was a first boot. So can someone tell me why she was a favourite on a fans versus favourite season? Francesca will forever remain perhaps the most bamboozling person to return as a favourite. I get production could only cast between seasons 16 to 25, but there was Natalie, Erin, Stephanie, Sabrina. We could have had Sabrina. But the producers decided a first boot superseded them all. Now, people have tried to explain this decision by production, as with Philip and her on the same cast, it would lead to a similar conflict to Redemption Island. Oh, and we got that. Much like 2 years ago, Philip didn't work with her, and we got a carbon copy of season 22, where she was the first boot again. It's really just an unfair decision by production. It's unfair to all the females around this time that would have been a better advocate for the favourites title, and unfair to Francesca herself, as she became the easy boot on her tribe because she already had been booted out first. Survivor fans have always dreamed about a first boots or early boot season, and both would have been a great fit for Francesca. But my goodness, don't make her one of the 10 favourites on the fans versus favourites season. But at number 1, what could be worse than picking a first boot to return? How about a quitter? Yes, at number 1, we started with Blood vs Water in Australia, and we're finishing with Blood vs Water, this time in the US. Colton participated in One World with some amazing qualities you'd expect with a person deserving of the 2-time return, such as crying about everything humanly possible, racism, and faking sickness to exit the show. A little known fact is Colton was supposed to return as one of the 3 captains on Philippines before the producers saw how much people disliked him on season 24 and quickly swapped him out. Now, people were happy with that, until it was announced he'd be on season 27, Blood vs Water. Now, to somewhat justify the producers' decision, they did cast him alongside his boyfriend Caleb, who was a pretty enjoyable presence on the show. That being said, if they wanted Caleb casted on the show, they could have, and this might sound crazy, just casted him on the show. The likes of Brandon and David had loved ones that played Survivor prior and didn't need to be casted on a show alongside them. On Blood vs Water, Colton initially seemed to turn over a new leaf, and dare I say it, came off as likeable, but quickly reverted to his old ways when his tribe weren't willing to do everything he wanted. At Redemption Island, he began crying and proclaimed he wants to quit the game. Only 7 days in. In the words of Jeff, we brought a quitter back and we gotta quit again. And you can just tell he is visibly angry with Colton. Colton even described in interviews Jeff shouted at him that he was the one to fight for him to come back. However, Colton ultimately folded when people weren't playing his game. It's safe to say we won't see him return. But thanks for watching, I really do appreciate it. Make sure to drop a sub if you enjoyed, and on the topic of returnees, if you want to come back to another video on the channel I made, a video talking about the most questionable advantages in Survivor is at the top left. Alternatively, you can check out my video where I have Survivor Micronesia, but I can't use the cast. Nonetheless, have a great day. Peace!